When my first love confessed his feelings to the new transfer student, everyone thought Ava would be devastated. What no one expected was that Ava was actually sitting on his roommate's bed, with something wet already soaking the sheets. Itan was about to confess to that new, beautiful girl. He had asked everyone to keep secrets about me, but he didn't know that some gossipers just couldn't hold back and had already told me everything. Everyone knew I was in love with Itan and dreamed of marrying him someday. This time, Itan seemed completely smitten with that girl. People thought I would make a scene, cry, and cause a huge ruckus. Everyone loves watching that kind of drama between men and women, and they were waiting for me to lose control, to run off and cause trouble. But, unfortunately for them, even after Itan successfully confessed, I still hadn't shown up. The crowd of onlookers, 3 rows deep, started losing interest. Even Itan's face didn't show much joy. He hugged his new girlfriend tighter and picked up his phone. There were no calls or messages. Itan furrowed his brow slightly. Then he turned to the crowd and said, "Tonight's on me. You're all invited." The spectators clapped. I had been behind some trees the whole time, and only then did I step out. Someone with a good view saw me and immediately shouted, "It's Mia! Mia is here!" I knew she wouldn't stay out of it. Itan looked up the moment he saw me, and the corners of his lips curled almost imperceptibly. I ignored everyone who was expecting drama and walked straight up to Itan. "Mia," he hugged his new girlfriend tighter. He looked at me and said coldly, "Feelings can't be forced. We've known each other for over 10 years. I don't want to say anything harsh and ruin our old friendship. From now on, I'll continue treating you like a sister. If you need anything, you can still count on me." Then, he lowered his voice. "With so many people watching, don't make a scene. Go home." "Itan," I interrupted, stepping forward slowly. He frowned again. "Mia, behave." I smiled and handed him the bracelet I had just taken off my wrist. "I came to return this." Seeing the bracelet, Itan's face suddenly darkened. "Mia, what game are you playing? Take the bracelet back. I won't bother you anymore." After that, Itan stared at me, his voice growing colder. "I don't care about this little bit of money. If you don't want it, throw it away." As soon as he finished speaking, I turned around and threw the bracelet into a nearby trash can. "You can throw away all the other things you gave me before too." With that, I left without looking back at him. When I reached the riverbank, it was raining heavily. Standing in the rain with an umbrella, I thought about the dreams I had in recent days. In the dream, because of Itan's confession to Lily, I cried and caused a scene to force him to break up with her. I jumped into the river that night, but what was the result? I almost lost my life. Itan stayed in the hospital for only 5 minutes before leaving. The determined Brown family, who had taken me in, thought I was embarrassing them by trying to commit suicide, and due to Itan's attitude, they felt I was of no use to them anymore. I was forced to leave school and sent back to my biological parents, who were involved in all kinds of vices. In the end, my life fell apart, and I died miserably in a foreign country. After I died, the one who collected my incomplete remains was exactly the one I had always feared and kept at a distance. Itan, newly married and radiant, never showed up. These days, the events from my dreams started becoming reality, one by one. If it weren't for these dreams, I would already be frantically calling Itan, threatening to kill myself and jump into the river. I am so grateful for that dream. It made me feel like I had been reborn. I can change my tragic fate, little by little. On the 3rd time I dialed that number, someone finally answered. I gripped the phone tightly and gently brought it closer to my ear. The name Daniel Black floated through my mind several times before I finally said it slowly. The heavy rain drowned out all the noise in the world, and only Daniel's voice, slightly lazy, sounded deep. "Mia. Daniel, it's raining heavily. I'm at the riverbank and I can't get back. Can you come pick me up?" There was silence on the other end of the phone for a few seconds. I nervously tightened the umbrella's handle with my sweaty palm. In the dream, when Daniel was collecting my remains, he seemed to cry. His tears fell, barely touching my decaying flesh and bones. Even in the dream, I could feel that burning sensation. Then, He carried a small jar with my ashes for the rest of his life and remained alone for his entire life. I couldn't help the tears and suppressed a sob. "Why are you crying?" Daniel's voice suddenly came through, still with that indifferent tone, even with a hint of impatience. "Didn't I say I would? So, when you arrive, wait. I'll be there in 20 minutes, okay? I'll wait for you." He didn't say anything more, and the call ended. 15 minutes later, I gave my umbrella to a mother and child seeking shelter from the rain. So, by the time Daniel arrived, I was drenched from head to toe. When he got out of the car, his lips were tightly pressed, his face as cold as if it contained frost and snow. I pushed my wet bangs aside and looked at him with a bright smile. "Daniel, you really are punctual. Mia, you could die of stupidity," he said, grabbing my arm coldly and pushing me into the car. Then, he threw a soft blanket over me. "Dry off. Don't mess up my car." He looked at me through the rearview mirror before circling around the car. Obediently, I wrapped myself in the blanket. I couldn't help but glance at him as he focused on driving. When he was expressionless, he always seemed so cold and unattainable. Many girls at school wanted him, but no one had the courage to confess. He was Itan's roommate. I used to visit Itan's dorm, and every time I did, Daniel seemed to really dislike me. Even now, though he came to pick me up, his attitude remained cold. At that moment, when he shoved me into the car, he used more force than necessary. My wrist still hurt, with red marks from his ring. It's hard to believe I secretly liked him all this time. I lowered my lashes slowly. Everything in the dream had become reality, but now, because of my changes, many things had also changed. Would Daniel still like me? And if he doesn't like me at all, am I causing trouble by acting like this? Back at the dorm, Daniel suddenly turned his head and looked at me. My heart skipped a beat, and I impulsively answered, "Yes, back to your dorm." Daniel gripped the steering wheel and snorted. "Itan won't be back tonight." I grabbed the edge of the blanket, twisting it tighter and tighter. "I'm not going after him." The car braked abruptly and stopped by the side of the road. As the car moved through the deserted streets, the silence between Daniel and me became almost suffocating, only interrupted by the rhythmic sound of the heavy rain hitting the roof. The streetlights passed quickly by the window, casting shadows that came and went like the bitter memories I tried to suppress. I glanced sideways at Daniel, who remained focused on the road. His face was rigid, but his eyes, always so cold, held a gleam I couldn't interpret. I wanted to speak, to break that silence, but the memory of the dream still burned in my mind, choking any word in my throat. I could still see Itan in my mind, with that mocking smile when I returned the bracelet. How he used to say he would always see me as a sister. How he did it publicly, in front of everyone, knowing full well what I felt for him. Even after years of friendship, he chose to have no regard for me, making my humiliation public. And all this to impress a girl he barely knew. Anger grew inside me, and I felt my heart beat with bitterness. But at the same time, something inside me also felt liberated, as if I had finally woken up from a ridiculous and illusory dream. Daniel interrupted my thoughts by braking the car sharply. I looked around, confused. He had stopped in front of the old city park, where we had spent so many carefree afternoons before Itan and that new girl came into my life and turned it upside down. Daniel turned off the engine and looked at me in a way I had never seen before. It was an intense gaze, filled with something between disdain and concern, and it disarmed me. "Why do you keep subjecting yourself to this?" he said, his voice low but sharp like a blade. "Why do you keep humiliating yourself for someone like Itan? Someone who doesn't even care enough to look back?" I swallowed hard. It was the first time someone said out loud what I had been trying to deny. I looked at my hands, still trembling, trying to find an answer that wouldn't sound pathetic. I thought he was the only one who really understood me, that he was the person I could build something with, you know. My voice came out weaker than I wanted, almost a whisper. But I guess I was just a fool all along. Daniel laughed, a humorless laugh, and shook his head as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Maybe it's time for you to stop living to please others, Mia," he paused, his gaze fixed on mine. "You have a whole life ahead of you, and all you've been doing is trying to be good enough for someone who never valued you." Is that what you want for the rest of your life?" His words hit me like a bucket of cold water. I had never thought that, in all these years, all I had done was try to be the person Itan wanted. For a moment, I couldn't respond. I just stood there, trapped in Daniel's gaze, feeling my pride being crushed by that painful truth. I murmured, "You don't know how hard I tried," feeling the tears burning in my eyes, but I swallowed my sobs. I thought I knew him. That we had something real. Something real. Daniel laughed again, this time with an irony that almost hurt. "Mia, you spent years chasing someone who only used you to inflate his own ego. Maybe it's time for you to free yourself from that idea. Leave Itan in the past and move on." For a moment, the weight of what he said hit me hard, and finally, somehow, I realized I was angry at myself. Angry for letting myself be manipulated, for trusting so blindly someone who only treated me like a second option, like a toy he used and tossed aside when he got bored. I felt the tears escape, but this time, I didn't try to hide them. I allowed myself to feel all the pain and anger I had repressed all these years. "I want to change," I whispered, finally looking at Daniel. "I want to be someone who doesn't need anyone to feel whole. I want to move on and leave Itan behind, for real." Daniel smiled, but there was still a hint of skepticism in his eyes. He leaned closer, placing a firm, comforting hand on my shoulder. "Then start now," he said softly but firmly. "Prove to yourself that you can. And forget Itan. He's the past. Stop caring about what he thinks. You have to be true to yourself before anything else." Those words, spoken by someone who had always been in the background of my life, carried an unexpected weight. It was as if Daniel had always seen something in me that I was never able to see. And in that instant, I knew I had to move forward. Maybe, in some way, Daniel had been waiting all this time for this decision, or maybe he just knew, in a way no one else did, how much I needed to break free. Without saying anything else, Daniel started the car again, and we drove in silence to my apartment. When he stopped in front of the building, I turned to him, feeling a new weight, but at the same time, a lightness I had never experienced before. "Thank you, Daniel, for everything." My voice was trembling but determined. He just nodded, and I noticed a spark of pride in his eyes before he turned back to face the steering wheel. There was something more there, a tension I couldn't identify. But in that moment, it was enough to know he was by my side. As I got out of the car and walked towards the entrance, I felt one last glance from Daniel on me. And for the first time, I didn't feel the urge to run back to him, to any man. I felt, in an unmistakable way, that maybe this was the first night of the rest of my life. A life in which I would finally be free to be who I truly am, without needing anyone's approval. I closed the apartment door, leaned against it, and let out a sigh. I looked around at the empty space I once imagined sharing with Itan and realized that future no longer existed. There was a whole new world for me to explore, and this time, with my heart and mind entirely focused on myself. It was my chance to start over. And, with or without Itan or anyone else, I knew I would never again allow someone to make me a spectator of my own life. That night, I lay in bed, my mind still racing. Daniel's words echoed in my thoughts. No matter how much I tried to ignore them, each sentence carried a heavier weight than the last. I settled into the sheets and took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, letting the darkness of the room envelop me and lull me to sleep. Silence took over everything, and gradually, I felt my body give in, falling asleep. Suddenly, I was in a place that seemed to be a mixture of familiarity and mystery. There were no walls, no doors or windows, just a calm, misty expanse where everything around me was soft and comforting. Walking toward me, I saw a vague figure, but one that radiated a sense of comfort. Its presence was almost palpable, and without needing words, I knew it was there to speak with me, to show me something I still didn't understand. It began to speak, and although I couldn't see its face clearly, its voice was captivating, serene, penetrating straight into my soul. "Mia," it began, "you've finally found peace. Not because someone filled an emptiness, but because someone who truly loves you brought you back home and stood by your side when you needed it most." His words touched something deep inside me. It was true. It hadn't been just the safety of the return journey, but the conversation, Daniel's attentive gaze. The way he held me when I was most lost. He didn't try to fix my problems. He just stayed by my side and made me see what I had difficulty accepting. It was more than friendship. It was something I hadn't allowed myself to recognize until that moment. And you know, Mia, the voice continued, true love isn't about filling someone else's empty space. True love is about understanding, supporting, and still challenging the person to be more than they believe they can be. That's what Daniel has been doing. And maybe you haven't realized it, but he's always been there, waiting for you to let yourself see that. I felt my heart warm with those words, and something inside me, something I had never considered before, began to make sense. All the silent support, the conversations, even the moments of coldness. It all seemed like a way for Daniel to protect me, to teach me to look beyond Itan, to see myself in a fuller way. It was almost as if he knew I needed this journey, that I needed the pain, but he would always be there, ready to hold me when I was finally ready to accept a true love. The figure smiled softly and disappeared into the mist, leaving me with a sense of clarity I had never experienced before. And at that moment, I felt the need to wake up. My eyes slowly opened, and I looked around the room, the real world coming into focus slowly. I woke with the feeling that I needed to do something immediately. Without wasting a minute, it was still early morning, but I got up with an unwavering decision. I grabbed my coat, left the house, and walked toward Daniel's apartment. I needed to see him, I needed to talk to him. With every step I took, I felt more confident, more determined. When I finally reached his building's door, I took a deep breath, feeling my heart beat faster. I slowly climbed the stairs, but with an urgency I couldn't contain. Standing in front of Daniel's door, I knocked softly and waited. Daniel opened the door with a surprised expression, clearly not expecting to see me there, especially at this hour. His eyes locked on mine, and for a moment he seemed to hesitate, trying to understand what I was doing. I whispered, looking at him with an intensity one had never felt before. I didn't need to say more, he seemed to understand as well. We slowly approached, and before any doubt could arise, I kissed him. I felt his body relax as he kissed me back, holding me in his arms with a tenderness and firmness that made me feel safe, whole. That was where I was meant to be, and nothing could make me doubt that. In the days that followed, we spent more and more time together. Our conversations, once so tense, turned into something lighter and more intimate, as if we had finally found the missing piece to understand each other. Walks in the park, movie nights, and moments when we just talked about life and our dreams. Every second with him showed me a world I had never known before. It wasn't an idealized love, it was a real love, with its imperfections, but at the same time, so genuine and intense that I felt I could trust him forever. As time passed, Daniel and I fell deeply in love. He showed me what it meant to be loved for real, without games or insecurities. He taught me to trust, to open up, and to share my vulnerability without fear. Each day by his side was a rediscovery, an experience of love I never thought was possible. He didn't try to change me, he only encouraged me to be myself, and I, at last, was learning what it meant to love and be loved fully. Then, one afternoon, as we were walking together in the park, we saw Itan in the distance. He was alone, looking confused and maybe regretful. When he saw us, his eyes lit up with a mixture of surprise and a hint of sadness. He approached, and for a moment, I stayed silent, waiting to see what he would say. "Mia," he began hesitantly. "I've been thinking. I've made a lot of mistakes, and I wanted to know if I could still have a chance with you." Looking at him, I felt a mix of nostalgia and pity. I had waited so long for those words, but now they sounded empty. Itan was no longer part of my world. He was a closed chapter, and I was sure I would never need him to feel complete. I took a deep breath and held Daniel's hand, looking firmly into Itan's eyes. "I appreciate it, Itan," I said calmly, "but now I have exactly who I should have always had, and that's all I need." Itan looked at me with surprise and resignation. Maybe he finally understood how much he had lost. Maybe he knew it was too late. He lowered his gaze, nodded, and gave a final wave before turning and walking away. Watching him leave, I didn't feel pain, only a peaceful tranquility, knowing that now I was exactly where I was meant to be. When I turned my gaze back to Daniel, he smiled, squeezing my hand with a tenderness only he had. We walked together, in no hurry, as the sun set on the horizon, lighting our way. In that moment, I knew I had finally found the happiness I had always been searching for.